I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tip, we're going to be doing an introduction to young adult books or teen books. If you've been following my channel for a few weeks now, I've been doing a series of introductory videos about the different levels in children's literature. Young adult books do count as children's literature. They fall under this umbrella. So if you're watching and you're a writer, or maybe you grew up in the 60s, 70s, or even 80s, you'll remember a time when there wasn't really a young adult genre. It was juvenile fiction. They were shelved in the same place at the library, and the place that sold Hello God, It's Me, Margaret, which is considered a young adult or teen book now, especially because of some of the topics that it's covering, also was shelved right next door to Beverly Cleary and The Mouse and the Motorcycle. So, you know, there's this kind of idea that young adult books, because they've become their own genre, are no longer children's books. They still technically are. What defines them is simply the age of the characters, the things they're dealing with, and the problems that they have. Within the umbrella of, we've got the children's books, we've got another smaller umbrella that's young adult, and within that we have nonfiction, we've got, you know, romance and supernatural. I know we all know Twilight, so Twilight, you know, falls on the umbrella of supernatural romance, but which became its own genre for a little while. We've got fantasy, we've got young adult contemporary novels, and they deal with a whole host of issues that teenagers are probably dealing with. They're set anywhere in fantasy worlds all the way up to, you know, high schools, and even some, which are now being called a genre called new adult, are being set in like that first year of college, something that kids are dealing with. You'll remember last week I said that kids typically like to read books about characters who are a little bit older than them, just by like a year or two. So if you're aiming your book at a 15 or 16-year-old, your main character might be 17 or 18. And so it's okay to go ahead and write these books where they're heading off to college, because this is what these kids are going to be dealing with soon. And they want books that they can relate to. Just like with the middle graders, they want and they need books that they can relate to. They need to know that they're not alone and that there's other people out there, even if it's fictional characters, to know that they can really relate and take those people in, and that there's somebody out there that gets them. Because they're smart enough at this point to know that if there is a character like that, then there's also an adult out there like that who also understands and wants them to know about these things. So unlike in middle grade, I talked about last week that there's a lot of very didactic nature in middle grade. Like, we're going to teach you about disability, and we're going to teach you about how to be more understanding. In young adult books, it's all about story and character. You have to create a good story, or the teens aren't going to keep reading. There are a glut of young adult books out there, and there's so many, and they have to do sometimes with almost the same subjects, that if you want your book to stand out, you have to capture your reader, you have to have them relate to you, and they have to feel like they're not being talked down to. That's so important. Teens can smell inauthenticity, and they need to know that you're not talking down to them, that you're treating them like an equal, and that you know that they are growing and changing and becoming who they're going to be, and that they're struggling and they've got questions, and all of that needs to be wrapped up in these packages of books that you're creating for them. Something else that's important to understand about young adult books is that there is kind of this crossover issue that's going on right now, where we've got books that are originally published as adult books, and because the character's a kid or a teenager, sometimes those books also are sold as young adult books. They're no different. So this is really important. The writing styles of these books, you do not have to write down to them. You can write an adult book for teenagers. The only thing is that your character is a teenager. That's it. And then they don't even have to end up in the young adult books, depending on the publisher and how it's sold and marketed. So Ready Player One by Ernest Cline is a fantastic example. The main character is, I think, 17 when the book begins, dealing with a lot of kind of teen problems, and also set in this fantasy world, this fantastic fantasy world. I love this book. It was marketed as an adult book. It's always been shelved in the adult section. However, when the movie started to come out, when they started working on it, they also created a young adult cover, and that book was shelved in the young adult section. No difference between the books. Same thing for Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. The book was originally published back in a time where there wasn't a young adult section. And so it was published as an adult book. And adults all over the world have loved this book for decades. And now it's also being marketed for kids. And it's got a different cover on it to kind of appeal to the younger audience. And that book's sold in the young adult section. So when you're writing a book for teens, don't feel like you have to write down. You can write the best, most amazing book. There are some incredibly written young adult books with wonderful language, with experimental ways of telling a story. The Book Thief by Markus Zusak is a fantastic example of an experimental way to tell a story. The book is huge, it is thick, and I think it's a challenge for anybody to read, young adult or adult. So don't feel like you have to be any different with these. Your characters are younger. I will say the biggest difference between young adult and adult books is that you need to have a bit of a hopeful ending. I don't want to say that everything comes out peachy for your characters, because that doesn't have to happen. But teenagers need and want to know that they can make a difference in this world. And that as they become adults, they are going to move into a world where they can actually create change, and that they can become better people, and that the people around them can become better people. And we need, I don't say we, that needs to be reflected in the books, because that's what kids want. The books that sell well are the books where the kids feel hopeful in the end. And I've read adult books where there isn't that hope at the end, and that's okay maybe for a jaded 40-year-old adult, but for a 16-year-old going out into the world, they want to know that they can change things, and I think it's okay to give them that. It's also okay to be honest and truthful. One of the contemporary young adult books that I wrote, the main character is not going to magically get better. He has some mental health problems. And in the end, although he has overcome a lot of the things in his past that have made him the way he isn't going to magically become better or stop needing a therapist. And that's okay too. It's okay to reflect both of those things, a hopeful ending and also reality. I also know that there are a lot of young writers around this age who are starting to develop their writing, and they're starting to create these wonderful stories about kids their own age. And it probably doesn't feel like you're writing a young adult book. It feels like you're writing a contemporary book about you and your life, or the world that you see around you. And I think that that is fantastic. Don't feel like you're less than just because you've only been writing for a year and there's somebody else who's written for 10 years, or that your books or your stories are not worth being told because you're young. I think that they are good stories to tell. And if you need to find an adult to help you get the, nuance of writing down, but also remember that your stories are going to grow. I wrote my first book when I was 17. It was terrible. It had no plot. None. And it had an interesting character, but it turns out she wasn't really a young adult character. And I thought I was writing a young adult book, but I really wasn't. I don't know what I was writing. I have since taken that character, plucked her out of that story, and moved her into another story that is a lot more interesting and actually has a plot. So that's something. So don't be afraid to, write in this genre. And even if you're young, you write about what you know. It's okay. Or write about what you want to know. And don't be afraid of the stereotypes and the labels and all the things that go with it. And if you write young adult literature, you are not writing less than. You are writing good stories that capture people's imagination to make them read. And the average reader for a young adult book goes all the way up until 29, I think. So it's okay. You actually are writing for adults, even though it falls under the umbrella of children's books. And I want to clarify what I said earlier about children's books in the umbrella, just because you'll go to a lot of conferences or children's book conferences and stuff like that, and there will be a lot of young adult writers that are kind of in those groups. If you go to the National Book Conference, the young adult writers are in with the children's books, and just period. And so that's how it still kind of falls under that umbrella. That's how it falls under the umbrella for librarians as well. The librarians are in charge of the children's books and the teen books. So I want you to understand that the umbrella exists for a reason, even though you as a writer should not be writing in mind that you're writing for children. I think that should be the case for anything you're writing. Honestly, I think you should be always writing good stories and not talking down to people. Maybe that's just me. So the last thing I want to talk about is your audience. So we've talked about how young adults are your audience. We've talked before with picture books and early readers and intermediate books about gatekeepers. The gatekeepers start to lessen at this point. We have less gatekeepers now. The parents before had the buying power. A lot of teenagers have jobs and they can buy some of the books on their own. They can get themselves to the library. They check out books on their own. They don't need their parents' prior approval. So you get rid of kind of that little bit of a gateway. And librarians at this point are also moving into more of a mentorship role when it comes to being gatekeepers. They're getting a lot of books in and then they're just recommending things to kids. What did you like to read? Here's something that's really good. Same thing's happening to high school librarians and stuff. So the gatekeepers are starting to lessen a little bit, and kids are able to get more access to books, even self-published ones. So they might buy books off on their phones, or they might buy books electronically on a Kindle or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you're starting to lessen some of your gatekeepers at this point. Obviously, there are still editors and agents who are kind of, I don't want to say controlling, but they're definitely in charge of what books are being published. And you have to keep that in mind. You have to keep in mind trends. You have to keep in mind what's going in and what's going out. So, now might not be the best time to hop on whatever cool trend is going on, because it'll take you a while to write your book and then a while for it to get published. So, and for all you know, the book that you're writing right now is the book that's going to be popular in 2 or 3 years. So it's just something to keep in mind about, the gatekeepers and the kids who are reading. But at this point, you're definitely writing more directly for your audience. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. We post new writing tip videos every week for all types of writers. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.